I really think this may be the dollar's last hurrah, the swan song for the dollar, because what's really going on right now geopolitically is we are reminding much of the world why it needs to move off the US dollar standard, especially some of these larger economies that are regarded as our enemies, like China, and some of China's friends like India, and now of course Russia. And I think the Arab world is also taking a hard look at what's going on right now and considering their tenuous relationship with the United States and how easy it would be for some future president to vilify Saudi Arabia or any of those other countries for a host of political reasons. And I think a lot of people are waking up to the reality of the dangers that this dollar reserve system portends for the rest of the world, in addition to the cost of maintaining the dollar status, because the US economy has so weakened industrially as a result of its reliance on this crutch, the ability to consume without producing, the ability to run enormous deficits, the fact that Americans don't have to save, that we can just go out and buy whatever we want and rely on the rest of the world to fund our profligacy. This is exacting a heavy cost on the rest of the world. But not only does the world have to bear the burden of this cost, but now they have to accept the risk of this status being used against them, as is fully evident from what's happening right now with Russia and the sanctions. So as I've been saying from the beginning, I think the United States has a lot more to lose from what's going on right now than Russia, because the ruble is just another currency. The ruble isn't the world's reserve currency. The dollar is. We have a lot to lose. Russia doesn't have much to lose. I mean, sure, Putin could lose some credibility, but as far as the overall Russian economy, who knows how much longer Putin's going to be in charge? The leadership may eventually change. Russia's status won't be dramatically diminished over the long run based on where it is now. But that's not the case for the United States. We enjoy this unique, exorbitant privilege as the issuer of the reserve currency, and our standard of living is dramatically higher than we would normally be entitled based on our productivity. Based on what Americans actually produce, we should be living a much lower standard than the one most Americans enjoy. And these higher living standards are only made possible because of the dollar's reserve currency status and the deficits that it allows us to run, both budget deficits and trade deficits. So the government can spend a lot more, and consumers can spend a lot more, and everybody can borrow a lot more, only because of the dollar status. And that is what we are putting in jeopardy. Now, I think it was in jeopardy anyway. We were going to lose that status solely based on the enormity of our deficits and the unsustainable fiscal path that we've been on for years. But I think what we are doing right now on the world stage when it comes to Russia is going to backfire and accelerate this process. Well, you know, when you live in a glass house or a glass White House, you shouldn't throw stones, because even more damage is going to be done to the U.S. economy, the U.S. stock market, the U.S. dollar, when the dollar loses its reserve currency status, which at the moment is hanging in the balance, and our own politicians, our own central bankers are clueless to the reality of this threat. Consumers are still getting a lot of propaganda from the government and the media that the worst is behind us, and of course all the inflation is simply a function of Russia and Putin. In fact, every time a price goes up, it's all about Putin, the Putin price hikes, as if the U.S. has absolutely nothing to do with it. We're taking the Federal Reserve completely off the hook. Whenever they talk about why prices are going up, they blame the pandemic, they blame Russia and Putin, or they blame the greedy corporations. But probably the most absurd of the excuses is trying to deflect genuine criticism of government spending. First of all, It's not necessarily the government spending that causes the inflation, because if the government raised taxes to cover the cost of that spending, well, then you wouldn't have the inflation. The inflation comes about when government spends money that it doesn't collect in taxes and relies on the Federal Reserve to create the money to cover the spending. It's called debt monetization or quantitative easing, if you don't want to call it by its real name, and that is what is causing inflation. Again, the definition of inflation, the original definition, before the government or academics tried to change it so that Americans wouldn't know the source of inflation, the definition is an expansion of the money supply. Putin is not expanding the U.S. money supply. Oil companies, nor any other company, is expanding the U.S. money supply. It's the Federal Reserve that's doing that. And why is it doing that? To accommodate government spending. And so the U.S. government is the sole cause of our inflation problem. You can't accept credit for the good things that you believe the bubble created without also accepting responsibility for the bad things that the bubble created. But of course, no politician wants to do that. You want to accept credit for whatever's good and shift the blame for whatever's bad. In 2019, this is the last year before COVID, the federal budget deficit clocked in at just under $1 trillion. Now, of course, these are the official government numbers I'm using. I'm not using the actual numbers, because the unofficial numbers, which are real, are much bigger than the numbers that the government admits to, because they don't include a lot of spending that they want to pretend is off budget, and so therefore they don't officially score it as part of the budget deficit. But if you go back to 2019, the deficit was about $984 billion, and the U.S. government was spending about $4.4 trillion. Last year, the U.S. government spent $6.8 trillion, and we ran an official deficit of $2.8 trillion. Of course, unofficially, well above $3 trillion, but the official numbers were $2.8 trillion. That means that the government was 55% bigger than it was in 2019. That is an incredible increase in the size of government. And I'm measuring the size of government based on how much it spends. But we increased the size of government by 55%, but we didn't increase taxes to pay for it. So how did we get 55% more government for nothing? We didn't. There is no such thing as a free lunch. So if we've got 55% more government than we had a couple of years ago, how did we pay for it? Easy. We paid for it with inflation. That's how government is being funded through inflation. Remember, the cost of government is not what it taxes, but what it spends. Every dollar of government spending equals a dollar of taxation, one way or another. And if they're not going to tax us honestly, they're going to tax us dishonestly, which is exactly what they're doing. They are taxing us with inflation. So it's ridiculous to claim that the U.S. government spending has absolutely nothing to do with the big increase in consumer prices, when that's exactly how this increase in government spending was financed. Because how else are we paying for 55% more government if nobody's taxes went up? And that's because everybody's inflation tax went up, and the inflation tax falls heaviest on those who are least able to afford it, the middle class,